Hi, I'm Jeff Rulifson. I manage the Advanced Development Lab at Sun Microsystems, and tonight we're going to hear about some of the technologies and systems and ideas that came out of Doug Engelbart's lab at SRI in the 60s and 70s. My experience with Doug started actually at the Fall Joint Computer Conference in 1965 when I was just graduating from the University of Washington and went to Las Vegas, expected to attend the Fall Joint Computer Conference, but met Doug and Butler Lamson and Peter Deutsch from Project Genie at Berkeley, and spent the next 3 days with them and went back to SRI and had the very special experience then of going to work for Doug and spending years in his lab. If we look back at the contributions that came out of Doug's lab, I think that you can look at them in sort of three different levels. There's a number of technologies that came out. There are a set of experiences and more abstract technologies that came out of systems integration effort, and there are the bootstrapping ideas, which I think are even a third level. The technologies, I think, receive most of the attention and press, and it's the easiest for people to latch onto. The idea of the mouse, the very first hypertext documents, the first demonstrations of video conferencing, the first graphical user interfaces, and even some of the initial disputes in graphical user interface wars came out of the experiences of that lab. And when you tell people Doug invented the mouse, they know in a very concrete way what you're talking about. However, Doug did a lot more than just these simple technology inventions. The lab built large applications using these inventions, and not only built them, but used them in the laboratory. And that led to a lot of ideas about how one uses and structures and stores the documents, and the notions of email and the first large journal or archiving systems using hypertext documents were built and used in Doug's lab. And those experiences, because people today still don't have those tools available to them, I think are very difficult for people to grab onto in their heads. But there's a third level of idea behind all of this that Doug has had. If you go back to the booklet I think they're handing out that Doug wrote in 1962, actually 35 years ago, you find a set of ideas in there that Doug refers to as bootstrapping. And I will simplify this a lot, maybe too much for Doug, but as we build these tools and we build the technologies, we can think that there are technical tools that we are building, but these technical tools go with human systems. And as we take the tools into our human systems, we change the way we do things. So as we adopt email, we change the way that we interact with people. We change the reasons that we have meetings, because we do things with email before we have the meetings. So if we can keep in our head the idea that there are human systems and tool systems, and that we need to actually think about and build these at the same time, that there's a kind of co-evolution that goes on. Then we could think about the idea of having groups inside companies that could do this and think about improving themselves in the way that they work by evolving both their tools and their human systems at the same time. We could even think about a more abstract idea of groups of improvement groups getting together and sharing their experiences, and maybe even using those tools or different sets of tools to help them evolve and improve the improvement process. And we could even think about then the meta-thinking and planning that we could go on when we think about how we would improve the improvement groups. Thank you.
History is always told from a particular perspective, so I make no bones about the fact that this is from my perspective. And I had the honor of being with Doug from roughly the beginning of '69 to '75, and so I do try to focus primarily on roughly that time frame. a little bit before, but not much after. So let me just talk a little bit about my view of what Doug contributed and what the group in general contributed to the industry. Doug obviously was the visionary, and it was sort of my job during much of this time to sort of be the intermediary between Doug and all of the programmers who were supposed to be able to make this work. And it was quite a challenge to understand what Doug was talking about. And these concepts may seem kind of normal today, but at that time they were pretty bizarre. And I'll go through some of the context of the time just to give you a feeling for how advanced Doug's thinking actually was at the time. Obviously, he formed the group. He got the organization SRI and ARPA and others to support it, and of course got funding for it. And he was also the chief spokesperson for the group. But fundamentally, his contribution was the basic theory of what we were trying to do and the direction of the group and how we made successively improved steps all along the way to move it forward. And fundamentally to set this goal of working on this generic problem of making it possible for humans to do a better job of dealing with complex intellectual pursuits. So you heard Jeff earlier in the videotape talk about this human system versus tool system paradigm. And this is one of the things that I think was very unique about what Doug was doing, and I haven't really seen much of this elsewhere in the industry. A little bit at the Institute for the Future, but mostly this is something that's generally ignored in the industry, where you have to co-evolve the human side of things, the organization, the procedures, the cultures, the disciplines that we have, how we talk about things, and the amount of and degree of training that we undergo to establish the skills and knowledge and so forth that we need. And that has to change as you introduce new kinds of tools that allow you to do things in different ways. And so Doug always had this in the forefront, and it's one of the strong lessons that I think all of us who worked on it learned from Doug, even though it wasn't carried on, as I said, very much in other contexts. So one of the main things that Doug did was force us to think about computers not as number crunchers, which was the way people thought about computers at that time, and really focus it on manipulating symbols so that it became part of the human thought process, which meant that the response time had to be really high because it had to work at the same level that your brain was working. But he had this basic structure that guided how we did things, where basically he wanted a comprehensive but open user interface where we could expand the vocabulary over time, introduce more and more things. And he wanted to be able to manipulate content and the relationships of content to each other. It wasn't just an issue of the words or the pictures and words. It was how that information related to other information. And obviously integrating text and graphics together was important because that helped communicate. With the notion of inter and intra-document links, which is common in the web today, but as of a few years ago, it was hard to even explain to people what that meant. But it was used, obviously, to great extent, as you saw in the demo that just finished. With a rich way of navigating around among all of this information that got built up by you and your colleagues, with a structure that allowed multiple documents in multiple windows so that you could both view related material that happened to be in different documents and also edit across document boundaries. And also, obviously, the user had to have a very rich control mechanism for how things got presented to him, and often what Doug calls views, or view specs, was the actual mechanism that allowed people to very facilely change the way the information was being displayed. So what was going on in the late 60s? Well, the ARPANET was just conceived, and as you heard, the second node of the ARPANET, the thing that actually made it a network, actually happened here. And so we were actually able to do our first communication with UCLA. But it was just a thought, basically. We had a lot of research institutions around the country that were all doing independent things, and ARPA had the wisdom to try to hook them all together so that we could share value generated in one in another. The Network Information Center, as was discussed by Jeff, was needed. We needed a way to centrally control a lot of the development that was going on in the ARPA network. But the main way that people dealt with computers was through hard copy teletypes, mostly capital letters, The only kind of text editing capability that existed on any computers at that time was essentially line-by-line editors where you moved an imaginary cursor around in a line and edited words and characters out of it or into it. There was some text formatting, so you could get reasonable looking documents by putting some embedded codes in. And there was some early work by Van Dam and Nelson at Brown University on hypertext, which in my mind relates more to what we think of as undo today than what hypertext now means, which is much more what Doug's links were all about. And out in the wide world, there was, the hippies and love generation and all of that. It was a very strange time. So obviously Doug gets a lot of the credit for the work that's done here, but in fact, it's any significant endeavor like this involves the work of a lot of different people. So I've tried to try to capture in the next 3 slides some of the things that I believe came out of this work by a group of very talented people, obviously led by Doug, but each individual in the group all making rather significant contributions. Well, first of all, this was the first system that I know of where there was a comprehensive user interface, where the whole system was embodied in one paradigm, one model for how to do things. We had actually developed a formal language for describing the user interface, and there was a formal mechanism for interpreting that. So you could actually reload grammars and change the user interface almost instantly. So it allowed us a lot of flexibility in what we were doing at the user interface level. Obviously, the structured documents and multiple data types all integrated together into one document happened at this time. The facile view presentation filters that Doug was using in the film there was a quite important part of this, and it still isn't available anywhere today. Advanced formatting controls for printing. It was still embedded controls, but it was carried to a much greater degree than anywhere else. There was this integrated cataloged email system called the Journal, which was a repository of most of the email that was sent around among the members of the group, and you could link to it, and it became a permanent repository, and hence you had this ability to build on ideas and know that the links that you had to this earlier information were good forever, and even those ideas still are not available today. There were shared screens for teleconferencing. There's a segment of this video a little bit later where some of that's demonstrated, which we could show after this is over if people want, that actually allowed you to look at it at two or more individuals could actually look at the same content on the screen. You each had a pointer. You could pass control back and forth. You could even, using the video system, do video inserts and see the other person in real time, carry on conversations and edit and view things together. Even today, this is fairly hard to do. As far as I know, this is the first system that had a completely integrated help system so that you could at any time find out what was going on and how to get out of whatever jam you were in. We used the system extensively to do our software development, and as a result of that, we really pushed the frontiers of software engineering quite far down the road, and there were a lot of really good software engineering system ideas that came out of this time. There was a very strong focus on very rapid response times, as I said. Early use of programmable microprocessors. We were one of the first organizations on the planet to use the then brand new 4004 from Intel. It was a 4-bit microprogrammed computer. And we actually built a whole system out of those things, which was quite hard. There were no development tools. It was really difficult. And we also had a preview mode. WYSIWYG is a term that got coined later at PARC for what you see is what you get. But we actually had a WYSIWYG preview mode in NLS. And we also did the pioneering work on the remote procedure call. A fellow named Jim White did that here. Well, a number of the people in this organization went on to Xerox PARC, so I did want to try to cover some of the things that transferred to PARC and some of the things that didn't. So there was at PARC, obviously, a very strong focus on documents and on text viewing and manipulation. I don't think that was due to SGI. It was partly the context and culture at Xerox. But this was clearly something that transferred over and was pushed a long ways at Xerox. The mouse-based integrated 2D graphical user interface obviously carried over. In fact, there was an actual implementation of a subset of NLS called UG done at PARC that actually in many ways was what everybody thought NLS was. When you went to Xerox PARC and you talked about NLS, they all thought it was this program called UG, which was probably only maybe a third of what NLS was, and was implemented in a slightly different way. So, I mean, people had kind of a skewed view of things. We did carry on the work with the remote procedure call style of network architecture. We developed a new form called Courier. In fact, Jim White did that work again. Obviously pushed the notion of windows and overlapping windows and cross-document editing a lot further. Integrated the help system. We had developed something, Bill Paxton and I, to some extent, had developed a modular programming system here at SRI, and that got transferred to Xerox and became what was later called Mesa. And we also had, obviously, a lot of work at SRI in terms of integrating different data types together into documents, and that was pushed a lot further at SRI, at Xerox. And there was some work in shared screen teleconferencing built into some of the applications that were done at Xerox. There were also a set of things that, for some reason, didn't make it into Xerox, and in fact, as far as I know, didn't make it into anywhere else. This, as I said earlier, this focus on the human system and the tool system evolving together has just not been pushed very much anywhere. The notion of structured files and filters and views and so forth didn't make it. The formatting of user documents by embedding codes obviously did get pursued elsewhere. In fact, HTML is a version of this today. But Xerox really focused on editing in the formatted view, what was called WYSIWYG editing. And so the format controls just weren't visible to the user in the same way. So that was a real advance, I believe, at Xerox. Integrated email repository, as far as I know, hasn't been done anywhere. And hypermedia and links, for some reason, just didn't catch on at Xerox. And that really didn't become popularized until just a few years ago when the World Wide Web came on the scene. Notion of a programmable user interface wasn't really pursued, and obviously the keyset didn't make it, even though the mouse did. On the other hand, there were a lot of really stellar contributions from Xerox PARC as well, and obviously the bitmap-based personal computer, Smalltalk, and the UI that was developed for that, a lot of which was copied in the STAR. STAR Workstation and servers was a complete integrated system, and borrowed a lot of ideas from the early work here at SRI and from other research efforts at Xerox. The Ethernet, the laser printing, WYSIWYG editors, and the cut and paste editing paradigm all came out of that time. The style of having a prefixed user interface, in other words, specifying the operands first and then the operator, was another big improvement that happened at this time. The style, as you might have noticed when Doug was doing his demonstration, that NLS had was what you might think of as an infix or prefix kind of notation where you specify the commands. Now, that afforded a real economy in terms of identifying the operands because you already knew the state and you could apply whatever semantics were appropriate with a single click. But on the other hand, if anything went wrong, it's sort of like dialing a telephone number and then realizing you got it wrong and you have to start it all over again. That was the way this worked too. You could either confirm the command or abort it, but it was very hard to back up and do anything else. The client-server distributed architecture, system architecture, was pushed, I think, a great distance by the folks at PARC. And the Mesa development environment was really a huge step forward. And this was, as far as I know, the earliest large-scale implementation of an intranet. I don't know, by the time I left Xerox in '82, it was thousands and thousands of Alto and Star workstations on multiple Ethernets all hooked together into a big internet. It was a real learning experience for everybody. Sometimes it didn't work so great. And also the notion of a user's conceptual model as a fundamental design methodology for doing system and user interface design was pioneered at this time. And of course, in the last few years, World Wide Web has come on the scene, and this whole notion of inter-document links and so forth have become very popular, and people use them routinely today. And that's wonderfully rewarding to all of us who did the pioneering work on this so long ago. It's astonishing that it took this long to become popular, but it's wonderful that it has. The links that were in NLS allowed you to talk about locations within documents, not just the beginning. And the World Wide Web does have this notion of linking within documents once you're in a document, or a page as it's called there. But it's quite limited compared to what NLS did, and there's still no notion of views and so forth. But it does have open and integrated data types, and all of that's a real advance over what we had back in the 60s and 70s. There's some integration with email, at least with Netscape, and so there's hope there that some of that will eventually become very strong. And the document page orientation is certainly very similar to what we were doing back in ARC days. Obviously, the whole set of protocols and file formats and so forth that have evolved there, and that's really good. And JavaScript and network computers and all of that, Java. So that's kind of where we are today. From my point of view, Doug and the Augmentation Research Center really did have a profound impact. And when you look back 30 years, it's kind of astonishing how little advance there has been over the last 3 decades. But you can certainly see the roots of an awful lot of what we think of as the modern computer environment right back there. And Doug was just a steadfast leader and visionary for the group. And although we went through some pretty tough times at moments, his leadership and inspiration was really admirable. But as I said, any significant contribution involves lots of different people, and some of them, including Bill English and Jeff Rulifson, made major contributions to what we were doing here. And there's still a lot to come. And I just want to close with this last slide. These are just some things that occur to me that seem to me to still be lacking in the industry. Hypertext integration of email repository I've already talked about. I think if we could build that kind of mechanism or some kind of collaborative use of email along with the hypertext mechanisms, it would be really great, especially if it could involve some kind of annotation or something. More use of the structure of information rather than just the text or pictures themselves. More seamless integration of databases, I think, would be a big help. You can see a lot of that in some more advanced web pages today. I think you'll see a huge amount of it over the next few years. More use of some presentation controls so you can move around in information more facilely would be really great. Better teleconferencing or video conferencing with better screen sharing and editing and viewing together. I think especially with regard to devices that are trying to view web content on televisions, that you're going to see a lot more use of animation and video and streaming audio to make it seem more television-like and less computer-like. And hopefully there'll be more focus on the human system evolution as well as the tool system. Thanks a lot.